Okay. All right. Well, hi, Philip and Mahdi. Hello, and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Nour Joudah, a non-resident fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Today is Tuesday, August 20th, 2024, and I'm delighted to be here with Philip Proudfoot and Mahdi Zaidan from the Accountability Archive. The Accountability Archive describes itself as a crowdsourced record of journalists, politicians, and public figures endorsing or encouraging the ethnic cleansing of Gaza and or defaming pro-Palestinian activists. Though the contents of the archives are currently not publicly available while analysis on the data is still being conducted, the website does offer request access for research purposes. I first came across the Accountability Archive on Twitter, or X, in the early months of the genocide in Gaza. The account at the time was cataloging and sharing instances of journalistic malfeasance, and the handle at Archive Genocide and their call for submissions from the public caught my eye. The Archive's X account has now grown to over 50,000 followers, and according to the organizers, has received tens of thousands of submissions to the database. Today, Philip and Mahdi will share with us, I hope, how the archive came about, how it's coming along, and their plans for the future, as well as what it's like to undertake such a massive project and the, I imagine, taxing experience of wading through such incredibly graphic material. So first of all, thank you both so much for being here. And before we jump into talking about the archive, Philip and Mahdi, if you could each just take a minute and introduce yourselves to our audience, that would be great.
I'll start. Yeah, my name is Mahdi, and I'm a researcher. That's my full-time job. I'm a researcher at the Institute of Development Studies in Brighton, where I'm speaking from. That's my full-time daytime job, but historically and after work, I try to involve myself in as many social movements or causes that I care about. Before coming to Brighton, before moving to the UK, I was involved with the feminist and LGBT movement in Beirut. That's really where I got started. I've been involved with them in research projects and work with the movement in general. And since getting here and since the events of October, it's been feeling like I could definitely do more, not doing enough with my current work. And that's where I find myself with Philip and Alex and with the Accountability Archive.
Okay. So hi, yeah, my name is Philip Proudfoot. I'm a research fellow also at the Institute of Development at the University of Sussex. My work is largely on humanitarianism, mostly in the Middle East, but I've also done research on the political lives of Syrian workers in Beirut. I wrote a book about that, called Rebel Populism with Manchester University Press. But yeah, I came to the archive through that kind of humanitarian work, and I guess we'll talk about it, but getting sort of fed up with the depoliticized humanitarianism that we have in the world today, where you have so much like open calls for breaking the foundational humanitarian norms and very little being done about it. And a lot of my academic work now is about how to like re-ingest the political aspects of humanitarian action.
Okay, great. Thank you both so much. I think it'd be great for our audience if you could start, Philip, if you want to start us off just by telling our listeners a little bit about what the archive is and what it contains.
So we came up with the idea of doing this archive when we were returning from one of the massive demonstrations in central London against the genocide in Palestine. And we were talking just on the train back to Brighton, where we live, about the Iraq War and just how many politicians, journalists, and public figures who supported that war, said horrendous things, gave it cover, gave it justification, just went on to have perfectly normal careers, successful careers, continue to occupy positions of power and influence, despite their role in generating justifications for a war that, you know, by some estimates can count around 1 million dead. And then we started thinking also about, and at the beginning, and in the sort of towards the end of October, I think a lot of people were like looking at what was just being openly said on Twitter, thinking, this is kind of crazy. Like, people are openly expressing genocidal intent in a way that, we haven't really ever seen before. And then that conversation then turned on to, well, we should document this. And the week before, when I was giving my like introductory lecture to this course on social movements I give, that my colleague who convenes it with me was asked by one of the students, and she's a historian of public health. And the student said, "Oh, it must be so easy for you now doing research on this because of the internet." And she said, "Actually, it was far easier when we had paper archives, because think about what happens when you leave a job. Your email account is deleted. So we think that data is everywhere and that we have so much of it, but in reality, we have data abundance, but it's incredibly fragile." So all these like streams of thought came together, and we thought, well, we have to try and do something quick to document this sheer amount of evidence. So we started with this Google form. We made a Twitter account, and we started with a Google form, just allowing people to directly upload tweets along like certain specific criteria, like, for example, journalistic malfeasance, so people not doing their basic journalistic duties of reporting truth accurately, or people generating underplaying or undermining the death numbers, or calling for the direct persecution of Palestinians. And we made this basic Google form, and the thinking was that because it was everywhere, we just had to get something out really quick and really fast and start capturing it. And that's what also then led to it being a crowd post initiative. So the point of the archive is not that we're a team of researchers ourselves scouring Twitter because there's just too much data. It's crowdsourced, so anyone can see it. And then it basically took off from there. And I think one of the reasons you mentioned our tag, and I actually think, things like the tag archive genocide are kind of why it gained such prominence, is that because when you see something horrendous, you can put that, and it's as if you're saying, we're watching you, we're recording this. So then that brought more eyes to the screen. And then it's just grown, and now I think by some measures we're sitting on the largest archive of securely stored evidence of individuals supporting, excusing the genocide, or defaming those who seek to resist it.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of incredible to think about. I mean, not in a great like way that makes you feel good, but incredible in the sense of it really, we spent so many months, and we are continuing, unfortunately, 10 months in now, to be increasingly both shocked and not surprised at this point by anything that comes out of the mouths of Israeli or American or otherwise officials, or the public for that matter, right? So soldiers posting on TikTok, generals, etc. The Google Doc that you mentioned that kind of started all of this off, can you tell our listeners a little bit about what it was asking, and like the kinds of categories? You mentioned a couple of them, but like what kinds of submissions were you getting initially, and how,
I'm
if at all, has that changed?
So initially, when we came up with the categories, it was just four out of the ones that we have now. Today we have 11 or 12, and they keep growing. But initially, we started with around four, and at the core, they were related to, if I'm remembering correctly, the first one was about dehumanization. So any rhetoric that dehumanized the victims of the conflict in Gaza. The second was anyone calling for an act of genocide. So that was specifically calling for disproportionate levels of violence against the Palestinian people. Encouraging war crimes with another one was, so these were like things like people saying, well, if only Hamas would give up the hostages, then the US military or the Israeli military would spare them. Then food would come back. So it's basically like equating the right to civilian life under war with access to food and water.
Starvation.
Exactly, threat of starvation. And these were senior media, I mean, people that were quite high up in the media saying that, or arguing back against activists and saying that. And the last one was a general defamation of anyone that is supportive of the Palestinian cause or simply Palestinians online, defaming them as terrorists, as baby killers.
Yeah.
There were lots of words that were used. So the general term was defamation.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, what we were looking for initially, we really wanted people who were in the West generally. So we wanted to look at statements coming from power holders in the West because we thought when we observed the ecosystem of people working on this very topic, there were enough people working on statements coming from Israel. There were a lot of people working on actual evidence of war crimes, and that's an important distinction. So there were lots of organizations like Amnesty and Palestinian organizations within Palestine who were actually documenting the war on a day-to-day level and producing evidence that targeting of civilians was happening. What we wanted to concern ourselves with was the statements made by Western politicians, journalists, and activists, people who are holders of power in some way or another, and their rhetoric in empowering and giving legitimacy to war crimes. Because that's A, what we had access to, and B, because we felt like this wasn't being covered in as much detail by other organizations.
Yeah.
So we had a niche role to play, but also something we had access to.
Because we're not equipped to process and collect evidence of war crime. There are obviously better suited organizations for that. Like what we are equipped to do is the sort of political accountability. And the example you gave of people kind of, and this is like what, because of my humanitarian research background, the thing that this sort of insidiousness of some of these political statements. So David Lammy, who's the foreign secretary in Britain, even now, since we have a new government and everyone kind of thinks, they're somehow better than the last one. David Lammy repeatedly says things like, what we need is a ceasefire to get the aid in, which sounds reasonable, right? But it's a kind of an example of the insidious kind of normalization of something that is actually not normal in the humanitarian system. Imagine him saying, the only way we can get aid into Ukraine is if there's a ceasefire. The humanitarian system is designed to provide assistance even in conflict zones. What it requires is for one of the belligerents not to repeatedly target humanitarians. But so there's this insidious quality that a lot of the tweets capture, as well as the more just flagrant like calling for like mass atrocity, which we also have. But we do get people submitting evidence of war crime. But in that case, we just try and pass it on to other organizations who are more adept at like handling and that specific type of information.
Yeah. Philip, you shared a bit about your sort of how the idea came about for you in these conversations with your students, this train ride. Mahdi, for you, your involvement with the archive, what drove the idea for you? What was kind of your main impetus of participating and of working on the project and continuing to?
I mean, the impetus was very similar. I didn't want to see people that got recycled from the Iraq War, from really all the different failed interventions and corrupt dealings with the Middle East get recycled into yet another conflict. I mean, that was the main impetus, is that we wanted to create a record, a memory of what happened, of how alienating it felt at the time to see and observe the damage and violence and death, and yet have an entire establishment claim otherwise. And also, we wanted to, as the work started going and we were engaging with people who were interested in helping, people who were submitting, another thing that became important for me for the future of the archive is to find new uses for it, because there's many ways we can use the data. One is to create a memory of the present, and another is to like hold people accountable in the future. But a lot of people were interested in actually using the media that we were collecting to build campaigns as well. So this hasn't happened yet, unfortunately, but it's one thing that I would really love to sort of mobilize our data for. Just sort of like back checking candidates, people who are running for office, people who are making statements about the conflict in the future against statements they've made in the past, against sort of like their relation to the conflict as it happened now. So that is one thing I want, is that I want this archive to become useful for activists and for organizations who are pursuing accountability. I want this to be more than just a historical record, because it already is that. That's already the case. We've already, in one way or another, achieved that. But I want it to also, map sort of like the different involvement of important actors in this.
But we've discussed this a lot, that because there's within the art, some people will tell us that they like to use the archive because it's kind of when you feel this intense sense of powerlessness, it's sort of like you're investing a hope in the future that we'll look back at this moment and say, what the hell were all of these people thinking? My God, this is such a moment of shame for our collective humanity. But you sometimes I think that hope is too optimistic. And of course, Palestine's had 75 years of this, looking back. And
yeah, I mean, the other motivation is fear of repetition. It's something that should not be repeated. And the only way to stop repetition from happening is to really understand what went wrong, and really to showcase the level of knowledge people had and the level of information that was coming out, and the level of duplicity that went on. So it's really a project of both fear and hope.
Yeah, and it was also, a project of opportunity, because one of the reasons why people were able to make all of these genocidal statements on X is thanks to Elon Musk removing all of the systems and safeguards in place that meant things that people might not have necessarily said in public. Now they can say in public. And now if they say in public, well, we can archive that and we can collect it and we can create this resource. But it does require that investment of hope that it will, there will be a future in which Palestinians are not systematically dehumanized to such an extent that you can say things that are just unconscionable, that we read in the archive day in, day out being submitted.
Yeah, and the other part is that, of course, so many of us from the region are now part of a diaspora, and we feel ourselves in positions and places for whatever reason that we have no power or impact on the situation, no matter how hard we try. And there needs to be more spaces where we're building a future that's better. And there's many ways to do it. I'd like to hope and think that this accountability archive is one of them. And it really plays that palliative sort of role.
And we've expanded it to include Lebanon now, and
one thing about the categories.
No, you're good. Go ahead.
One thing about the categories and their evolution is that the website is crowdsourced. So the submissions that are made by people who read and respond to our tweets. And of course, as things develop on the ground, as the conflict engulfs Lebanon and Yemen, we have added categories related to events there. So targeting of particular places in Yemen, in South Lebanon, particular stories that were being told about why it was legitimate to bomb Yemen and to bomb South Lebanon. These were one of the ways we tweaked our analysis to capture this data better. And it's just really for me, and I think for many people who have shared this, it's a way of feeling like you're not sitting idly watching something horrific taking place far away and feeling hopeless.
I mean, so two things. One is I think is a point that you touched on that is so important, which was interesting that, Philip's reaction to it maybe was that it's perhaps optimistic or so, but I think this is something that is so interesting, and all three of us as researchers and or academics, right, is that the archive historically is first of all such a colonial tool to begin with, and is understood as a colonial tool to be allowed to be used as something that is a record of people, but not necessarily something that not only people have access to, but also a question of whether or not people, it reflects the experience of what it's actually recording, right? And in the name itself of the accountability archive, you've infused it with that optimism to some degree, right? Is that this is not just an archive of the genocide, but this is an archive to be utilized on the question of accountability. And I do think that that is a really significant part of this, not only in its intention, but like you've also shared in the formatting of how you're actually collecting the data, the fact that it's crowdsourced, the fact that this is a collective effort, and in a lot of ways is a community archive in the way that it is being built and the data is being collected. And on that note, I also kind of would love to hear from you a bit of, because you get all of these submissions and they are in the tens of thousands at this point. As these come in, I mean, this is an incredibly laborious project. How do you kind of verify and organize the data that's coming in and these submissions that are coming from people?
Well, you're data lead, so you
yeah. So basically, we have around 30,000 submissions as of today, above 30,000, but around as of today. It's grown really quickly. So we came up with the plan of how to quality control basically throughout the life of the project. Initially, people were just submitting. So what happens is that you have a web page that you click on, you get a submission form, like literally just a submission bar actually, and you put a link in. When you put the link in, you get a different option, very basic ones, depending on whether it's a tweet or not. If it's a tweet, it's a bit harder to archive. There's an extra step. If it's not, then it almost automatically archives most of the data. And that's step one. That's the first step whereby the crowdsourcer submits something with a tiny bit of information and a link. And that's usually it.
It tells you whether we already have it.
Oh yeah, it does tell. That was one of the updates we had, is that it tells you that this something might have been already archived.
And people really like it when they see that it's already been submitted, because it's again that palliative thing where they don't feel as much alone in
it. It's good for you in the sense that you're kind of removing some potential redundancies in the database.
Yeah.
People also are like, okay, this, I know for a fact that this is somewhere already, and we're not going to lose a piece of information.
So the crowdsourcing does the input of the data. They give us a bit of information about, okay, when was it said, when was it published, by whom, and what do you think it relates to? And then from our side, what happens is two things. The first is we do a check that the categories that were submitted were correct. And we also check that this isn't completely out of our remit. So sometimes people will share things that are descriptions of, there'll be just debates basically, and the debates have merits but not related to the rhetoric regarding genocide, or there'll be about discussions on like the casualties, for example, that don't really pertain to any ideological content or any content that's denying or furthering anything. These will dismiss sometimes or will place in a special box. And that really finishes the second step, which is just checking the data is correct, the data is relevant. And then the last step, which we do, is one of the more complicated one. And that step involves ticking a few boxes, and it's basically like trying to add as many tags as possible to each submitted point of data. So let's say a tweet was submitted. I'll go through the tweet and I'll try to give it as many tags as possible that makes it relevant for future researchers, future users in general. So I'll try to see whether this person is in a position of power, what kind of power, what institution they come from. And then I'll look at the rhetoric itself. I'll see whether it's denying something, whether it's calling for violence, whether it's calling for violence against civilians or against a group of people, whereby we could definitely assume that civilians would be included. So for example, against a hospital or a school. If someone is trying to claim that a hospital is not a hospital or a school is not really a school, these have special tags. And we get more granular sometimes with trying to map out all the actors involved in the statement. So do they mention, for example, Hamas? Do they mention the PLO? Do they mention the Ministry of Health? Do they mention a particular person of note from Gaza? Or do they mention someone of note from Israel, from the US? And we try to get as much information from this tagging so that each node, each point of data has all these associated tags that someone who is a future researcher and wants to get all the data related to point X. So they want to look at all the posts that mention a school or a hospital or Ministry of Health or a particular actor. They can do that quickly, and they can see when they were referenced and in relation to what and by whom.
So I could say I want to know every time a senior British politician has questioned the validity of the health ministry's data, and then I could produce like every tweet that's been logged in that category, every newspaper article.
You'd have to know the name of the British politician,
yeah.
or you can get like British
British
politician.
It's like an indexing system.
So it's an indexing system essentially, and that is the slowest part. The fastest part is, of course, the crowdsourcing, the first step whereby people submit. So we have 30,000 of those. The tagging and the checking is slower. We've only done 1,000 out of the 30,000, and that work is being done by initially volunteers. It was me and Alex, our founder, just doing it in our spare time. And then eventually, when we did our first crowdfunding, we hired someone to help us out on on a chunk of the data. So we wanted to first look at the American chunk of the data because they were a neat number. There was like 2,000 of them at the time before the campus protests. And we thought we have the funding to go through all of these 2,000, so it'd be good to get all of that data. We know there's a US election coming up. We're not sure how much we'll be able to like publish by then or write anything about it by then, but that was our thinking at the time.
Yeah. And it was a pilot. We wanted
a
pilot the indexing system with a distinct category of like US politicians.
Right. Or any posts marked that as the US, which means they've been made in the US. Sometimes we do get a few submissions that are related to random accounts, people of non-influence, as the tag is called. And it's basically just to like make sure that we're not really like having that we're noting the fact that some of the submissions may be random accounts, maybe people who are repeating certain points are not really the originators of points. Because sometimes you'll see a claim that's being made by 100 accounts, some of which have no username that's discernible and have no profile. Right, and they're repeating things, and they didn't innovate that sort of rhetoric.
Because that's like a different project, but it's still a relevant project. Like we're not collecting individual random low follower accounts on X or or Instagram or whatever, but that's still part of a broader like influencing, like figuring out how one statement then became normalized such that people like repeated it across Twitter would be really interesting. But that's
also
more
out of your purview of you're trying to do too many things at that point.
We're tagging it so that in case it's possible in the future, it could happen, so that we have a distinction of like, okay, we don't think this person really was the first to say this. But currently that's not what we're doing. What we're doing is taking stock of what we have now. For the most part, that's really what we're involved in.
And just remember, the primary obstacle is just to get this before people change their mind and delete it, and to secure it in a way where it is fully like a proper screenshot of the whole thing with all of the comments and dates and time, and that's all of course already started to happen. So there's already stuff in the archive that's previously people have gone back and people were potentially appalled by what they said and they deleted it, but we've stored it and we have it secured and stored so that people can't pretend it was never said. And I should have mentioned it, but another motivation in that deletion sense for the project is, I don't know if you're familiar with, like, after YouTube changed its algorithm for all of the lots of videos from Libya were deleted. And there were videos that were showing like evidence of like various sorts of war crimes were recorded and they were all removed from YouTube. Because for violating gore categories, but the consequence was all of this sort of important human rights evidence was gone. So that's why
I mean,
this
I've noticed that on YouTube in general. Like
yeah,
if I don't download something, or if I don't, years from now I'll go look for the same video and it's gone, it's been
it's
taken,
gone.
and if no one saved it, that's it, it's
Yeah,
gone.
yeah,
You mentioned, I think, given the size of the database, the number of submissions, and this very, I think, critical intention of, like we said earlier, not only sort of storing a record and preventing folks that are, deleting, or an attempt to kind of flee accountability, like in the most literal sense. Um, there is also just the labor that's involved in this that you're
yeah.
describing is quite extensive, and I imagine will be a very kind of long-term project. I mentioned in the beginning, when we started our conversation, and as is mentioned on the website, that the database is not currently available to the public. I mean, to do these kind of searches that you're talking about, because you are still doing so much of the analysis and so on, but that there is a request access process for researchers. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about that, given that so many of our listeners are academics or students, professors, et cetera, that might be interested in kind of pursuing that.
Yeah, basically our policy is that if you have a use for the archive and you're someone who could be vouched for, then we're happy to give you access. We're now working on making the access a lot easier, giving more tools to users to divide the data in whatever way they want, to tag even the data in new ways that perhaps we didn't think of before. So we're always trying to improve really just like the user interface, because we realize that's probably the main block. But for now, although the aim eventually is potentially to have it open as much as possible, for now it's more of a case by case scenario.
And you just have to email the address on the web page to gain access, and then we can provide access. And we have, yeah, there there's no risk of deletion when you gain access, because we created, like, a tiered membership. So you have the editorial access, which means you can reassign tags, and then you have a viewing or analysis access, and that still will allow you to add tags. So essentially it's kind of like the archive has its own kind of like en vivo max QDA type thing within it. I don't know if it was the most efficient thing to do to essentially produce like our own qualitative tagging system, but we have produced that.
Yeah, and like we're constantly trying to like give more like options for people to use the data with our interface. But yeah, if you just message our Twitter, email on the website. We've worked with a lot of partners before.
Yeah.
We're constantly looking for new partners, new uses. So if you have a creative idea, please come to us. It's literally there to be used. Yeah, it has no value outside the use people put.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm curious too. I mean, I also kind of alluded to this in the beginning. I mean, something that so many of us have been going through, whether you are directly tied to Gaza or whether you are just watching the horrors of the last 10 months, and let's be honest, the last 80 years, is the experience of also like going through this data and listening to some of these statements, right, in coordination with the images that you're seeing as a result of the statements that are being made. If maybe you could share a little bit also of your own experiences of what it has been like to do this work in the midst of actually participating, right, also in the social movements in the UK and so on.
You know, I'm from South Lebanon. I grew up in Lebanon for most of my life. I was born at a time where most of the South was still occupied by Israel. Every single member of my family has a horrific story about one of the wars that were ongoing in South Lebanon during their childhood, during their adult life. They recount their life history with reference to the various invasions. And growing up, I found it hard to read even about the history of Palestine, because I just got quite upset and quite emotional at the injustice of it. And the conflict, watching it on news was difficult, but I must say that working on the project and seeing the submissions, that has been the most therapeutic part of this entire journey. Because there's something about seeing someone saying something so hateful and being able to do something very small, but yet still being able to do something about it to at least preserve it, if nothing else, has been really, really good, I would say. Um, so it hasn't been painful for me, um, at least from the submissions I've seen. I've seen a few hundreds. I don't know, I might be seeing some of the better ones. But yeah, for me personally, it's been more positive than negative, really, because it felt like I was doing something, and that really made a lot of difference.
And we're part of a community. There's a lot of archivists doing different sorts of specific projects, and when you get to, we went to Paris and we got to meet up with French counterparts, and because you then don't feel that you're going crazy, that you're looking at this and thinking this is just, how is this not at the front of the news all the time? How is it just allowed to continue? That sense, when you're part of that community, it feels a bit more, you're getting some strength from that. And then for me, like obviously as like a British person, I have nowhere near the same experience that Mahdi does, but I've previously have received the sort of pushback that you get as a white person mobilizing for Palestine, which is you get the accusations of anti-Semitism. And but because I've gone through that and I fought back against that, and legally, I won on that front, that I feel a lot less exposed and more willing to put my face out there for the archive and for the project. Yeah.
I think something that you both speak to so much in this project and the entire project is it also is very upfront about is about operationalizing the archive, right? Is that
Yeah.
this is not kind of, as your students or folks mentioned, right, in the beginning on this train ride, and you guys having this conversation about documents versus sort of this digital situation that we find ourselves in today. But the other side of that is that these older archives that are document based and sort of materially kind of located somewhere, et cetera, they also collect dust. They're also not accessible to everyone, right? Whereas there's these digital archives that are being built today, at least if not immediately, the goal is for them to eventually be open access, that anyone can reach them from anywhere in the world, that you don't have to travel to the metropole of London to access these archives, right? And so they can also be operationalized in also a different way for movements. And I think that's such a big part of the work that you're doing and that you speak to.
Yeah, I mean it's horrendous to say it, but like one of the facts about this genocide is that we are actually documenting evidence around how genocidal behaviors and acts can be normalized, unlike any other period in history. This is like kind of a bit like capturing the everyday conversations of German Nazis. It's like hearing the everyday conversations of people in Rwanda. Like you can't. It's a capturing of data that in the history of mass atrocities we've never had before.
I mean, it is definitely like that when you see when like we got the chance to archive the Telegram channels of
The Telegram channel.
Israeli citizens and soldiers who have served in Gaza or just reacting to the news of what's happening in Gaza with glee, with all sorts of like horrendous sentiments, asking for more. Yeah, you do get a snippet of that every day, and you see it on Twitter for free. You don't even have to like go to an archive. You just see
Right.
it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean that's why we hope that the archive, like, of course we're focusing now obviously on Palestine, but as a method for like documenting how mass atrocities how sort of a complicity and support can be generated, and what power holders think they can say in these situations. It would obviously have expansion beyond Palestine as well, that we can collect and archive this kind of material. And it is urgent for the reasons we've talked about, which is that even we don't just collect tweets, right? We're also collecting news articles. And if you look back at the Iraq War, there are actually a huge amount of articles that were written at that time on web pages that went bust, news organizations that went bust that are just gone.
Yeah, that's right.
And you know, it's very important to collect that digital material and not assume it's safe.
Yes. Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I think it's an incredible project and immense amount of work that you and the team have put into it. So thank you so much for not only the work, but sort of sharing the story and hopefully also as a part of this conversation, more people will be able to know about the archive, to submit, to use it. Before I let you both go, is there any final thoughts you'd like to share?
Have we covered everything?
I think yeah, just like a shout out to Alex, who's not with us here today. They really had the idea from the beginning. They've given a lot of time and effort to this project. So they're not here today, but they
Yeah.
are really like a core of this project. They've given a lot of time, a lot of energy to making sure this project worked. And they also run the Twitter account. So all of this thing about seeing the violence, they get a lot of submissions of like evidence of actual violence, and they put up with a lot of things that take a toll and put a lot of investment in this project. So yeah, just a shout out to them as well.
Yeah.
Great.
And all our partners and collaborators over the months because we've had a lot of support.
We've had
There
a
is
lot of support.
a lot of support
Yeah.
from, you know, a lot of
You
organizations.
mentioned briefly, obviously, you know, you shared that this kind of the plan got diverted once campus protests happened in the US and so on. But you mentioned that there was, you know, initially an idea of kind of a pilot category that would be sort of tagged, analyzed, and perhaps that you would write something about. Are there still plans to do that perhaps with a different category or to publish a portion of the analysis before
That work is still ongoing.
So the US project is still ongoing. It's just slightly slower.
Yeah.
We're almost entirely volunteer based, and we only have one non-volunteer working on the whole thing. So it's a lot slower than we thought it would be. But the aim is still the same, which is to have a tagging of the US data. And then once we know what that data looks like, to do something with it. We're also, if you have ideas, for what we could do with that data. We have a lot of posts, articles, just videos from the US of politicians from both parties making statements that should be put under scrutiny. So if you have ideas, please come to us. It's really just a matter of time and effort what we do with that data.
Yeah. I mean, we'll be producing hopefully like a sort of basic report on the US data, then also along with that a kind of what is the archive, how does it work, its methods type report, just so people are more aware of what it is we're intending to do with this crowdsourcing approach to archiving support for mass violence and genocide. That's basically where we're at, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, sounds like you have a lot of work ahead of you, as all of us do in our respective efforts. But thank you so much, genuinely, Mahdi and Philip, for sharing your time today, for all of the work that you're doing. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in to this episode of Occupied Thoughts. Please make sure to check out the Foundation for Middle East Peace website, www.fmep.org, for resources related to this podcast and lots of other great content on Palestine. And please make sure you are subscribed to this podcast to stay up to date. You can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, and you can watch video versions of our podcasts on YouTube. With that, I am Nour Joudah. I'm signing off until the next episode of Foundation for Middle East Peace's Occupied Thoughts. And thank you again so much to Mahdi and Philip for joining us.
Thank you, Nour.
Thank you, Nour.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.